Across the windswept plains of what is now Texas and northern Mexico, two worlds collided. One was ancient and rooted in the land, a people of the plains whose mastery of the horse made them a power no one could ignore. The other was the Spanish Empire, a vast machine of conquest, faith, and ambition, reaching across oceans in the name of crown and cross. When they met, the Spanish expected another frontier to conquer. Instead, they found a nation that would reshape the balance of power in the American West. This is the story of how the Comanche, once a small offshoot of the Shoshone, rose to become the lords of the plains, humbling one of the world's greatest empires, and forcing Spain to retreat not through treaty, but through exhaustion. By the early 1700s, Spain's empire in the Americas was immense. From California to Chile, from the Caribbean to the deserts of New Mexico, Spanish rule stretched further than any before it. Gold and silver mines fueled its wealth, Catholic missions spread its faith, and presidios, frontier forts, guarded its fragile edges. But beneath the grandeur, Spain's northern frontier was vulnerable. The distances were vast, the garrisons small, and communication with Mexico City or Madrid could take months. The empire relied on fragile networks of missions and trade to keep distant lands loyal. When Spanish soldiers rode north from Mexico into the plains, they entered a world unlike any they had known. Open, endless, and alive with movement. Herds of buffalo, shifting tribes, and the growing presence of a people who did not build cities, but who commanded the land in ways Spain could scarcely understand. They called them the Comanche. The Comanche did not begin as an empire. Their ancestors were part of the Shoshone people who lived far to the north, in the mountain basins of present-day Wyoming. Their life was harsh and the bison herds distant, but sometime in the late 1600s everything changed. From the south came a new creature, the horse, brought by the Spanish to Mexico more than a century earlier. At first, the Shoshone saw it only in rumor and trade, but those who learned to ride found their world transformed. Mounted, they could hunt further, move faster, and fight with a power no foot warrior could match. Bands of Shoshone began to drift south and east, drawn by the open plains and the vast buffalo herds. In that migration, a new identity was born. They became known as the Comanche, from the Ute word Comanche, those who always want to fight. To their neighbors, they were fierce, independent, and unyielding. To themselves, they were simply Numanu, the people. In the grasslands of the southern plains, the Comanche discovered the perfect union between rider and horse. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. A man's wealth was measured not by possessions, but by the number of horses in his care. They became the greatest horsemen the continent would ever know, and the horse became their engine of freedom, mobility, and dominance. The Spanish first encountered the Comanche in the early 1700s as they pushed north from New Spain into what they called Tejas and Nuevo Mexico. They came expecting submission. Instead, they met resistance unlike any they had seen since the days of the Aztecs. The plains were not suited to European warfare. Spanish cavalry, heavy and slow, could not match the speed or maneuverability of the Comanche riders who could fire arrows at full gallop and vanish into the grasslands. Raiding parties began to strike at Spanish missions and settlements, often without warning. At first, Spanish governors dismissed them as scattered bands of horse thieves, but the raids grew bolder, striking deeper into colonial territory, reaching as far south as Durango and Coahuila. By mid-century, Spain realized it faced not mere raiders, but a rival power. A nation on horseback, organized not through written law but through kinship, alliance, and skill. The horse changed everything on the Great Plains. It turned hunting into surplus, mobility into power, and warfare into art. Comanche hunters could pursue entire herds of bison, feeding their people and trading meat and hides with neighboring tribes. Warriors could travel hundreds of miles in days carrying news, gifts, or vengeance. Their villages, clusters of teepees near rivers, could appear and vanish with the seasons. Spanish officials struggled to comprehend this fluid world. They drew maps and built forts, believing territory could be controlled by walls and flags. But the Comanche lived by movement. Where Spain saw empire as land, the Comanche saw empire as mobility, control not of places, but of paths, trade routes, hunting grounds. and the rhythms of the plains themselves. By the 1740s, the Comanche had established their heartland, the Comancheria, stretching from the Arkansas River in the north to the Edwards Plateau in the south, from the Rockies eastward toward the plains of Texas. It was an area larger than most European kingdoms, patrolled not by soldiers but by families bound through shared purpose. To fight the Comanche, Spain tried everything. They built more presidios, hoping to anchor the frontier with soldiers and missionaries. They dispatched diplomats to negotiate peace, offering gifts and trade in exchange for safety. And they sent expeditions into the plains attempting to strike first, but every tactic failed in its own way. The forts were too few, the distances too vast. Spanish soldiers, often poorly paid and unfamiliar with the terrain, could not pursue enemies who seemed to melt into the horizon. Even when Spain managed to capture a Comanche village, retaliation soon followed, swift, coordinated, and devastating. Diplomacy fared little better. Spain's envoys brought crosses and treaties, but the Comanche valued results, not paper. Trade agreements often collapsed when Spanish governors failed to deliver promised goods. The Comanche saw this as weakness. By the 1750s, entire Spanish settlements were being abandoned. The empire that once crushed civilizations now found itself defending small, isolated outposts from people it had dismissed as nomads. The humiliation was not in defeat on the battlefield. It was in the slow realization that no victory could hold. By the late 18th century, the Comanche stood as the undisputed power of the southern plains. Spanish merchants and even governors began to recognize their authority. Peace could exist only with Comanche consent. They mastered not just war but diplomacy and trade. Horses, mules, hides, and captives became the currency of the plains. They traded with the French, bartered with the Spanish, and later negotiated with the Americans, always on their own terms. Their power rested not in population but in movement, intelligence, and the unity of family-based bands that could gather for war or scatter for survival. The Spanish called them Los Indios Barbaros, the wild ones. But in truth, they were a sophisticated society built on knowledge of land, horse, and alliance. Comanche leaders such as Paruaibo, Iquaracapa, and later Buffalo Hump and Ten Bears maintained a balance of terror and respect that kept European powers cautious. Even at the height of imperial strength, Spain could never impose direct control over the plains. By the 1790s, Spain's empire was fraying. Resources were stretched thin across continents. Revolts simmered in South America. On the northern frontier, the Comanche remained defiant, too strong to destroy, too independent to absorb. Spain began signing peace treaties that acknowledged Comanche sovereignty over much of the plains. It was a quiet admission that the empire could not win. Trade replaced war, and Comanche diplomats rode into Spanish towns as equals, not subjects. They came adorned in buffalo robes and eagle feathers, riding horses finer than any the Spanish could field, living symbols of how completely the balance of power had shifted. In Madrid, few understood how an empire could be stymied by what they saw as a tribe, but those on the frontier knew. The plains belonged to those who could master them, and the Comanche had done so completely. By 1821, as Spain lost Mexico to revolution, its northern frontier collapsed. The missions fell silent, the forts emptied, and on the plains the Comanche rode free. The Comanche victory over Spanish ambitions was not a single battle or decisive campaign. It was a slow, relentless triumph of adaptation, of a people who mastered a technology introduced by their enemies and used it to reshape a continent. Spain's empire had been built on the conquest of cities. The Comanche fought from open land. Spain relied on roads and supply lines. The Comanche needed only grass and water. In the end, it was not European steel or strategy that decided the fate of the plains, but knowledge of wind, herd, and movement. Long after Spain's banners disappeared from Texas and New Mexico, the Comanche legacy endured. Their influence shaped the patterns of trade, migration, and settlement that followed. Even the routes of modern highways trace the paths of their movement. By the mid-19th century, new powers would come: Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and the expanding United States. Each would in turn face the same challenge: how to fight a people who did not yield, whose homeland was as vast as the horizon itself. For more than a century, the Comanche remained the pivot of power on the plains. Their dominance began with the fall of Spanish ambition, and ended only when the modern world finally closed around them. History often remembers empires by their monuments, cathedrals, palaces, and the flags they left behind. But sometimes the true test of empire is not what it builds, but what it cannot conquer. On the plains of North America, the Spanish Empire met a force it could not subdue. Not because the Comanche had more men or weapons, but because they understood the land better than anyone else. In every direction, they could vanish into the wind, regroup, and return. Their strength was not in numbers, but in freedom. The Comanche did not need walls to define their world. The horizon was enough. And when empire came for them, they answered with the one lesson the frontier never forgets: that even the mightiest power can fall before those who refuse to be ruled.